In the ancient forests of British Columbia, a moment of pure instinct is about to change everything. When Frank Morrison hears the desperate splashing in his farm pond during the worst storm in decades, he thinks it's just another animal caught. In the floodwaters, he couldn't be more wrong. What he finds isn't a struggling deer or trapped wolf. It's a bear cub, seconds away from drowning, its tiny paws clawing at the darkness. This is not just another animal rescue story. This is about how one farmer's split-second decision to save a dying bear cub would unlock a mystery hidden in these mountains for centuries. What follows is the story of an extraordinary connection between man and nature that would reveal why Native Americans called this valley the place where bears walk with men. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Morrison's hands were as weathered as the ancient cedar fence posts that marked the boundaries of his farm. At 63, he'd spent more years working this land than most people spend in any single place. The Morrison family farm sat, nestled in a valley that the locals called the Bowl, a perfect circle of fertile land surrounded by towering mountains that seemed to cradle the earth like protective giants. Every morning for 40 years, Frank rose before the sun, pulled on his worn boots, and stepped out into whatever weather British Columbia had decided to throw at him. Today was no different, except for the gathering storm clouds that made the morning darkness deeper than usual. His wife Sarah had called him crazy when he decided to keep farming after she passed 5 years ago. "The land's too much for one person," she'd said, but Frank knew something his Sarah hadn't. This land was more than soil and trees. It was alive in a way that few people understood. The farm had been in his family for 4 generations, and in all that time, something set it apart. From the other properties in the valley, animals behaved differently here. Wolves would pass through without bothering the livestock. Bears would gather berries at the forest's edge without ever approaching the house. Even the most territorial creatures seemed to respect invisible boundaries that no human had set. Frank's grandfather had told him stories passed down from the indigenous people who had lived here long before the Morrisons arrived. They spoke of a sacred pact between man and beast, though the details had been lost to time. Frank never put much stock in legends, but he couldn't deny that there was something special about this place. This morning, as he made his rounds checking the livestock, Frank noticed signs that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The chickens were unusually quiet. The horses huddled together in their paddock, ears pricked forward, staring at the forest's edge. Even his old dog Blue, usually eager for his morning patrol, refused to leave the porch. "What's got into you all?" Frank muttered, scanning the tree line. The mountains disappeared into low-hanging clouds that seemed to press down on the valley like a lid on a pot. The air felt heavy, charged with something more than just the coming storm. He'd seen weather like this before, but there was something different about today. The birds had gone silent, and even the insects seemed to be holding their breath. It was as if the whole valley was waiting for something to happen. Frank checked his watch, 6:45 a.m. The weather report had predicted the storm would hit around noon, but the darkness suggested it might arrive sooner. He needed to secure everything before the wind picked up. The pond would need checking too. Heavy rains could overflow the banks and threaten his irrigation system. As he worked, memories of Sarah flooded back. She'd always known when big storms were coming, could feel them in her bones, she said. Their last conversation had been about a storm, much like this one. "Nature speaks to those who listen," she'd told him. "This land has secrets, Frank. Sometimes I think it's trying to tell us something." Maybe she'd been right. Maybe there was more to this valley than even his family's long history here had revealed. The indigenous elders who occasionally visited the farm would smile knowingly when he mentioned the unusual behavior of the wildlife. "The land remembers," they would say, but never explained what they meant. Frank finished securing the barn doors just as the first fat droplets of rain began to fall. The wind was picking up now, bending the tall grass in waves across his fields. That's when he heard it, a sound that would change everything. A splash, followed by a desperate cry that was neither human nor quite animal, coming from the direction of the pond. The changes had started 3 months ago, though at first they were subtle enough that only someone like Frank, who lived in rhythm with the land, would notice. The deer began grazing closer to the house than they had in decades. The seasonal bear migrations altered their ancient paths, bringing them through the valley rather than around it. Even the salmon in the creek seemed more numerous, fighting their way upstream with unprecedented determination. Local wildlife officials dismissed Frank's reports. Animals adapt to changing conditions, they said. Nothing unusual about that. But Frank knew better. These weren't just adaptations, they were preparations. The indigenous elders had noticed too. Last week, Joseph Running Bear, whose ancestors had lived in this valley long before European settlers arrived, stopped by the farm. He stood at the edge of Frank's property for a long time, watching the tree line with ancient eyes. The animals. "Remember," Joseph had said, his weathered face serious, "they're coming home." "Coming home to what?" Frank had asked. Joseph just shook his head. "When the time comes, you'll understand. Watch for the signs. They'll show themselves to those who are ready to see." Since that cryptic conversation, Frank had observed even more unusual behavior. The normally territorial ravens began working together, building their nests in complex patterns around the farm's perimeter. Wolves howled in broad daylight, their calls carrying messages Frank couldn't decipher but somehow felt in his bones. Sarah would have understood. She'd always been more attuned to these things, keeping detailed journals about animal behavior and weather patterns. Frank found himself returning to those journals now, reading her careful observations with new eyes. One entry from 15 years ago caught his attention. "The land holds memories longer than people do. Sometimes I think the animals are trying to remind us of something we've forgotten, something important." The morning storm felt different from any Frank had experienced in his 6 decades in the valley. The clouds moved against the wind, swirling in patterns that defied natural weather systems. The temperature dropped and rose erratically, as if the very air was unsure of itself. Blue, his faithful companion for 12 years, refused to leave the house entirely now. The old dog sat by the window, whining softly, his eyes fixed on the pond. Frank had never seen him behave this way, not even during the worst storms. The livestock were no better. The chickens had stopped laying entirely, huddled in their coop despite the feed he'd scattered. His horses, usually calm in any weather, paced their paddock nervously, their movements synchronized as if they were performing some ancient dance. Even the plants seemed to be responding to whatever change was coming. The old growth forest at the edge of his property swayed without wind, and the crops in his fields bent in impossible patterns, creating shapes that reminded Frank of the petroglyphs he'd seen in nearby caves. Sarah's last journal entry, written just days before her passing, seemed prophetic now. "The valley is waiting for something. All these years, we thought we were the caretakers of this land. What if we're just part of something bigger? What if the land itself is preparing for something we can't understand?" Frank had dismissed these thoughts as the musings of a sick woman at the time. Now, standing in the increasingly strange morning light, watching his familiar world transform around him, he wasn't so sure. The air thrummed with anticipation, like the moment before lightning strikes. That's when the first real sign appeared. A perfect circle of ravens landed in his field, their black feathers iridescent in the strange light. In the center of their circle, a single bear track appeared in soil that hadn't seen a bear in months. The track was fresh, despite the fact that Frank had walked that very spot less than an hour ago. The storm clouds above began to spiral, focusing directly over his farm pond like a giant eye opening in the sky. The wind carried whispers in languages long forgotten, and the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. The storm hit with supernatural force, turning morning into night. Rain fell in sheets so thick Frank could barely see 10 feet ahead, yet somehow the water moved wrong, flowing uphill in places, swirling in impossible patterns that defied gravity. Lightning flickered continuously, but instead of the usual white-blue flashes, the bolts glowed with an eerie green tinge that reminded Frank of the northern lights. His pond, normally calm and clear, had transformed into a churning maelstrom. The water level rose rapidly, far faster than any natural rainfall could explain. Steam rose from the surface despite the cold, creating ghostly shapes that seemed to dance and twist in the strange lightning. Frank struggled toward the pond, fighting against wind that kept changing direction. His boots sank deep into mud that felt alive beneath his feet. The ground itself seemed to pulse with each lightning strike, and he could have sworn he heard drums echoing from deep within the earth. Sarah's final words rang in his head. "When it happens, don't be afraid. The land chose us for a reason." The coo. Ravens that had formed the circle earlier now perched in the trees surrounding the pond, their usual cawing replaced by an almost melodic trilling that cut through the storm's chaos. They seemed to be watching, waiting, their eyes reflecting the green lightning in a way that made them look ancient and knowing. Blue finally emerged from the house, racing to Frank's side despite his earlier fear. The old dog's behavior had completely changed. Gone was the nervous whining, replaced by focused determination. He led Frank toward the pond's edge, moving with the certainty of an animal following an invisible trail. The horses in their paddock had stopped their nervous pacing and now stood stock still, all facing the pond in perfect unison. Even the wind seemed to pause, creating an eerie pocket of calm around the water's edge. In that moment of stillness, Frank noticed something that made his heart stop. Tiny paw prints in the mud, leading into the water. These weren't the massive tracks of an adult bear, but the delicate impressions of a cub. They appeared fresh, the rain not yet having washed them away, and they headed straight toward the deepest part of the pond, where the water now churned most violently. A flash of green lightning illuminated the scene like a supernatural spotlight, and Frank saw it, a small, dark shape struggling in the center of the whirlpool. The sound that followed wasn't the crack of thunder he expected, but a deep, resonant call that seemed to come from the mountains themselves. It was answered immediately by a closer sound, the unmistakable bellow of a mother bear. Frank spun around. There at the forest's edge stood one of the largest black bears he'd ever seen. In any other situation, the sight would have sent him rushing for safety. But something was different. The bear's eyes held no aggression, only desperate worry. She paced the shoreline, clearly wanting to help, but unable to reach her cub in the treacherous water. Their eyes met across the chaos, and in that moment, Frank understood what Sarah and the elders had been trying to tell him. This wasn't just his land. It was a place where the old boundaries between man and nature blurred, where ancient pacts still held power. The mother bear's gaze held his for what felt like an eternity. Then, impossibly, she dipped her head in, what could only be described as a nod. Permission, pleading, a trust that went beyond the natural order. The cub's struggles were weakening. Its small head barely broke the surface now, tiny paws fighting against the swirling current. The raven's song reached a crescendo, their calls weaving together with the wind and thunder in an otherworldly chorus. Frank knew he had only seconds to act. Everything, the strange weather, the animal's behavior, Sarah's predictions, the elders' warnings, had led to this moment. He shrugged off his heavy coat, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and certainty. "The land chose us for a reason," he whispered, echoing Sarah's words. Then, with the mother bear's eyes on him and the raven's song in his ears, Frank Morrison did something that would change not just his life, but the very nature of the valley itself. He dove into the churning waters. The water hit Frank like a physical blow, shockingly warm despite the cold air. The pond that he'd swum in countless summer days was now something alien, a swirling mass of currents that pulled at his limbs with almost conscious intent. The green lightning continued overhead, illuminating the underwater world in surreal pulses. 20 feet ahead, the bear cub's struggles grew weaker. Its small black form was barely visible through the churning water, paws moving with decreasing strength against the mysterious whirlpool that seemed to be dragging it downward. Frank kicked hard, fighting against currents that made no natural sense, moving in patterns that defied physics. Underwater he could hear it, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from the earth itself, like the heartbeat of the mountain. The you sound grew stronger as he approached the center of the pond, where the cub now barely managed to keep its nose above water. A surge of current slammed into him, spinning him around. In that moment of disorientation, Frank saw something impossible. Ancient symbols carved into the rock bed of his pond, glowing with the same ethereal green as the lightning above. They looked like the petroglyphs from the caves, but these were clearly older, their patterns more complex, more alive. The cub disappeared beneath the surface. Frank dove deeper, the warm water pressing against his eardrums. The glowing symbols seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat now. His lungs burned, but he forced himself deeper into the whirlpool's heart. His hand brushed fur, then emptiness as another current yanked the cub away. Above, the raven's song penetrated the water, their unified voice carrying through the liquid with impossible clarity. The sound seemed to strengthen him, pushing back the growing need for air. Frank kicked again, following the moving symbols that now seemed to be showing him a path through the chaos. His fingers closed around soft fur. The cub, barely conscious, didn't struggle as Frank pulled it close to his chest, but the whirlpool fought to keep its prize, wrapping around them both like a living thing. Frank's vision began to darken at the edges. They were too deep, the surface too far away. That's when he felt it, a massive form moving through the water beside him. In the green-tinted darkness, he saw the mother bear somehow swimming through the supernatural currents with powerful strokes. Their eyes met again, and in that moment, the boundary between man and animal dissolved completely. The bear moved beneath them, her broad back pressing against Frank's legs, pushing them upward with tremendous force. The whirlpool's grip loosened. The glowing symbols flared brilliantly, then faded. Together, man, cub, and mother bear broke through to the surface. Frank gasped for air, still clutching the cub tightly. The mother bear guided them toward the shore with gentle nudges, as if she'd been training for water rescue all her life. The storm had stopped. Though the green lightning continued to flicker silently overhead, they reached the shallow water, where Blue waited anxiously, tail wagging. The ravens had descended from their perches, forming a protective circle around them. Frank gently lifted the cub onto the shore, his arms trembling from exertion and adrenaline. The small bear wasn't breathing. The mother bear made a sound of such profound grief that it shook the remaining raindrops from the trees. She nosed her cub gently, then turned to Frank with eyes that held too much intelligence, too much awareness. There was a question in those eyes, a plea that transcended species. Frank knew what he had to do. He placed his hands on the cub's chest, and the world around him seemed to hold its breath. The ravens drew closer, their wings brushing against him. The mother bear pressed her massive head against his shoulder. Blue whined softly, adding his voice to this impossible moment. And then, something extraordinary began to happen. As Frank's hands pressed against the cub's wet fur, the green lightning suddenly converged overhead, forming a spiral directly above them. The ancient symbols he'd seen underwater began appearing on the ground around them, etching themselves into the mud, glowing with the same otherworldly light. The mother bear's fur brushed against his left arm, blue pressed against his right, and the ravens completed the circle, their wings spread wide. Energy coursed through Frank's body, not electricity, but something older, something that felt like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Beneath his palms, the cub's chest began to glow. The light spread up Frank's arms, wrapping around him in spiraling patterns that matched the symbols on the ground. He felt a connection to everything around him, the trees, the mountains, every creature in the valley. In that moment, he understood what Sarah had meant about the land remembering. The cub gasped, water spurting from its mouth. But what happened next defied everything Frank thought he knew about the natural world. As the small bear drew its first new breath, its eyes opened, and they glowed with the same green light as the lightning above. The mother bear's eyes began glowing too, and when Frank turned to look at Blue, his faithful dog's eyes shone with the same supernatural light. Even the raven's eyes blazed green, their calls changing to a harmonic tone that seemed to resonate with the energy flowing through the earth. Then Frank felt the change in himself. His vision shifted, sharpened. Suddenly, he could see energy flowing through the land like rivers of light, connecting everything, binding the valley together in patterns that had existed long before humans arrived. He could sense every animal within miles, feel their heartbeats, their intentions, their connections to this ancient place. The cub stood on shaky legs, shook itself, and did something impossible. It spoke, not in words, but in images and feelings that bloomed directly in Frank's mind. He saw the valley as it had been thousands of years ago, when the first pact between humans and animals had been made. He saw his own ancestors, standing alongside bears, wolves, and ravens, all of them guardians of something precious hidden deep within the mountains. "Now you understand," a voice said, and Frank turned to find Joseph Running Bear standing at the edge of the circle, his eyes glowing like the others. "The land didn't just choose your family to farm it, it chose you to protect it, to restore the ancient balance." The mother bear moved to stand beside Frank, her massive shoulder pressing against his leg with surprising gentleness. Through their new connection, he could feel her thoughts. Gratitude, trust, and something more, a sense of purpose renewed, of ancient oaths remembered. The cub bounded between them, its supernatural eyes bright with playful energy. It touched its nose to Frank's hand, and another vision flooded his mind. Threats approaching the valley, people who would destroy this sacred place if they discovered its power. He saw himself standing with the bears, the wolves, all of nature, united to protect these ancient secrets. "Your Sarah knew," Joseph said softly. "She tried to prepare you. Now the time has come. The barriers between worlds are thinning. The old powers are awakening. The valley needs its guardians again." Frank looked down at his hands, now marked with faintly glowing symbols that matched those in the pond. He could feel the truth of Joseph's words in his very bones. The rescue hadn't just saved a bear cub, it had awakened something that had slept for generations. Blue pressed against his leg, the ravens landed on his shoulders, and both bears stood at attention beside him. Through his new senses, Frank could feel others approaching, wolves, eagles, even the ancient spirits of the mountain itself, all of them drawn to this moment, this awakening. "What happens now?" Frank asked, his voice carrying new harmonics that resonated with the raven's song. "Now," Joseph smiled, "your real work begins." As the green lightning faded and the first rays of normal sunlight broke through the dispersing storm clouds, Frank began to understand the full magnitude of what had happened. His senses remained heightened in ways that both amazed and overwhelmed him. He could feel every heartbeat in the forest, sense the deep roots of trees communicating beneath the soil, even taste the emotions of animals miles away. The mother bear, whom Frank now somehow knew was called Shadow Walker in her own language, began leading her cub in a complex series of movements around the farm's perimeter. Through their newfound connection, he understood they weren't just marking territory, they were reactivating ancient protective boundaries that had laid dormant for generations. "The patterns they're walking," Joseph explained, watching the bears with knowing eyes. "They're the same ones carved in the pond bed. Your ancestors called them the lines of harmony, paths that connect the physical world to the spirit realm." Blue trotted alongside the bears, as if he'd been doing it his whole life, his own eyes still carrying traces of that supernatural green glow. The ravens maintained their formation overhead, their wings casting intricate shadows that seemed to strengthen the energy lines now visible to Frank's enhanced vision. "But why now?" Frank asked, watching Shadow Walker guide her cub through another complex pattern. "Why did this power choose to awaken today?" Joseph's expression grew serious. "The earth has cycles like the seasons, but much longer. Your Sarah sensed it coming. That's why she kept those journals. The valley is waking up because it needs to. There are people coming who would destroy this sacred place if they knew what it truly was." As if in response to his words, he felt a distant disturbance through his new senses, a discordant note in the symphony of natural energy that now surrounded him. Something mechanical and harsh was approaching the valley's outer boundaries. Shadow Walker felt it too. She paused in her ritual, turning to face the distant threat. Her cub, which Frank now knew was called Star Swimmer, pressed close to her, sighed. Through their shared consciousness, Frank saw flashes of what worried them: metal machines, men with destructive intentions, and something else, darker figures that moved like shadows between worlds. "Development companies," Joseph said grimly, reading Frank's expression. "They've been buying up sacred lands all across the province. But what they really want, whether they know it or not, are the power points. Places like your pond where the veil between worlds is thin." The bears completed their circuit, returning to where Frank stood. Star Swimmer, seemingly recovered from his near drowning, bounced playfully around Frank's legs. Despite the serious situation, he couldn't help but smile at the cub's enthusiasm. Through their connection, he could feel the young bear's joy and curiosity about their new bond. Shadow Walker pressed her massive head against Frank's hand, sharing more detailed images, ancient ceremonies performed by his ancestors alongside her own, humans and animals working together to maintain the balance between worlds. He saw how his family's farm had been purposefully placed to guard one of the most powerful convergence points in the valley. "The animals remember," Joseph said softly. "Even when we forgot, they kept the old ways alive. Now they've chosen you to help restore the balance." A wolf's howl echoed from the forest, followed by another, then more, a chorus of voices calling out in welcome and recognition. Frank could feel them approaching, drawn by the awakening power. Not just wolves, but every major species in the valley was sending representatives. "They're coming for the gathering," Joseph explained. "It hasn't happened in over 100 years, all the guardian species assembling to renew the ancient pact. Your act of sacrifice, saving the cub without thought for your own safety, proved you worthy to witness it." Star Swimmer suddenly stood alert, his small head cocked to one side. Through their connection, Frank felt what the cub had sensed: vehicles turning onto the road that led to his farm. The ravens quickly scattered, maintaining their protective circle, but making themselves less conspicuous. "Right on schedule," Joseph sighed. "The developers always follow the awakening. They don't understand what they're sensing, but they're drawn to places of power like moths to flame." Shadow Walker growled softly, but not in threat. She was reminding Frank of something his grandfather used to say: "The land knows its true guardians." Now, finally, he understood what those words really meant. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, but Frank found himself strangely calm. Through his enhanced senses, he could feel the land itself responding, shifting subtle energies to make the ancient protective boundaries stronger. Shadow, Walker and Star Swimmer melted into the forest edge, but their presence remained strong in his mind, alert, watchful, ready. "Mr. Morrison," a crisp voice called from a black SUV now pulling up his driveway. "I'm Richard Chen from Pacific Northwest Development Corporation." The man who stepped out wore an expensive suit that looked absurdly out of place against the muddy farm backdrop. Two more vehicles followed, disgorging what looked like geological survey equipment and a team of technicians. Through the earth beneath his feet, Frank felt the land's instant rejection of these intruders. The energy lines that Shadow Walker had reactivated pulsed with warning. Even more telling was the complete silence that had fallen over the valley. Not a bird call, not a cricket chirp, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Quite a storm you had here," Chen observed, picking his way carefully across the muddy ground. "Our meteorologists were quite interested in the unusual patterns it displayed. Actually, that's partly why we're here." Frank felt Joseph's silent presence beside him, though to the developers, the elder seemed to have vanished like the bears. Through their shared awareness, Frank could sense multiple layers of reality overlapping. The physical world where Chen and his team moved, and deeper spiritual dimensions where ancient powers stirred. "Your property sits at what we believe is a unique geological formation," Chen continued, gesturing to his team to begin unloading their equipment. "We've detected some very unusual energy readings in this area. We'd like to conduct a survey, with your permission, of course." Star Swimmer's thoughts touched Frank's mind, sharing memories of similar men at other sacred sites, places that had been destroyed by those who couldn't understand what they were destroying. Shadow Walker added her own memories, spanning generations, of humans who had tried to exploit the land's power rather than protect it. "I'm afraid this isn't a good time," Frank said firmly, feeling the truth of the words in his bones. "The storm did some damage that needs attending to." Chen's professional smile didn't waver, but Frank's new senses detected a spike of frustration and something else, something darker. "We're prepared to make this worth your while, Mr. Morrison. Your property has unique qualities that our investors are very interested in." As if in response to Chen's words, the ground beneath their feet trembled slightly. The technicians setting up their equipment looked around nervously, but Chen seemed unfazed. Frank realized the man had felt nothing. Only those connected to the land could sense its reactions. Through the bear's shared consciousness, Frank saw beyond Chen's polished exterior. The man was a conduit for forces he didn't understand, drawn to places of power, but blind to their true nature. What he called geological anomalies were really the sacred convergence points that Joseph had mentioned. "Your offer is appreciated," Frank said carefully, "but this land isn't for sale. Never has been, never will be." Chen's smile tightened fractionally. "Mr. Morrison, perhaps you don't understand the opportunity here. Our initial surveys suggest significant mineral deposits. The potential value—" He was interrupted by a chorus of wolf howls, much closer now than before. Frank felt their approach through the web of energy that connected all life in the valley. They were coming to pledge themselves to the renewed pact, but to Chen and his team, they were a clear threat. The technicians quickly began packing their equipment, casting nervous glances at the forest's edge. Chen maintained his composure, but Frank could sense his unease. "Think about our offer, Mr. Morrison. We'll be in touch. The valley is changing. You might want to make sure you're on the right side of that change." As the developers retreated to their vehicles, Frank felt a surge of approval from the watching animals. Without realizing it, he had passed another test. Shadow Walker's satisfaction radiated through their connection. He had stood his ground without revealing their presence or the true power of the land. "They'll be back," Joseph's voice came from beside him, the elder seeming to step out of thin air. "With more resources, more determination." They can sense the power here, even if they don't understand it. Frank nodded, watching the SUVs disappear down his driveway. Then we'll be ready. Word of the strange storm spread through the village of Cedar Creek like wildfire. By sundown, Frank's phone was ringing constantly with calls from concerned neighbors who had seen the inexplicable green lightning concentrated over his farm. Some reported animals behaving oddly, while others swore they'd seen impossible shapes in the storm clouds. The local diner, usually quiet on weekday evenings, was packed with residents sharing stories. Martha Jenkins, who ran the general store, claimed all her wind chimes had started playing the same melody during the storm, despite there being no wind inside her shop. Old Tom Peterson, who'd lived in the valley for 80 years, said he hadn't seen anything like it since his grandfather's time. Frank sat at his usual corner table, nursing a coffee and listening through both his ears and his new supernatural senses. Shadow Walker and Star Swimmer remained hidden in the forest near his farm, but their consciousness stayed linked with his, allowing him to experience the village through their perspective as well as his own. "It's not just the storm," Betty Williams was saying to anyone who would listen. "My chickens have been acting strange for weeks. They've formed perfect circles in their coop, all facing inward like they're having some kind of meeting. Same with my horses," added Mike Thompson, Tommy's father. "Found them all standing in geometric patterns in the field. Never seen anything like it." Through his enhanced awareness, Frank could feel the truth beneath their observations. The animals of the entire valley were responding to the awakening, preparing for the gathering. Even the domestic creatures remembered their roles in the ancient pact. Sheriff Laura Chen, no relation to Richard Chen, Frank had checked through his new senses, slid into the seat across from him. "Frank, you were at the center of whatever happened today. Those developers who visited you, they filed permits for geological surveys all around the valley. Said they're looking for mineral deposits, but something feels off about the whole thing." Frank studied her carefully. Through his connection to the land, he could sense that Laura had her own ties to the valley's old powers, though she wasn't aware of them yet. Her family had been here almost as long as his, and the land remembered. "Trust your instincts," he said quietly. "The valley has ways of warning us when something's wrong." The diner's door chimed as Joseph entered, drawing uncertain looks from some of the older residents who remembered other times. The indigenous elder had appeared just before significant changes in the valley. He made his way to Frank's table, nodding to Laura as if he'd expected to find her there. "The signs are clear to those who know how to read them," Joseph announced, his voice carrying through the suddenly quiet diner. "The valley is waking up. The old stories my people told about this place, they weren't just stories." A murmur ran through the crowd. Everyone in Cedar Creek had grown up hearing the indigenous legends about their valley, tales of sacred pacts between humans and animals, of boundaries between worlds growing thin, of guardian spirits watching over the land. Until today, most had dismissed them as interesting folklore. "The developers," Laura said thoughtfully, "they're not really here for minerals, are they?" "They're drawn to the power," Joseph confirmed. "Like moths to flame, but they don't understand what they're approaching. They'll destroy everything trying to control what was never meant to be controlled." Through his link with Shadow Walker, Frank sensed more animals gathering in the forests around the village. Wolves, bears, mountain lions, traditional rivals, coming together, united by something bigger than their individual territories. The ravens maintained their watch, spread out across the valley, but still connected in that mysterious, unified consciousness. "We need to decide where we stand," Frank spoke up, feeling the weight of generations in his words. "The valley protected your families for generations. Maybe it's time we returned the favor." The diner fell silent as his words sank in. Through his enhanced senses, Frank could feel the land's energy touching each person present, awakening old memories buried in their bloodlines. Many of their ancestors had been part of the original pact, though the knowledge had been lost over. "On time! There's a town council meeting tomorrow night," Laura said finally. "I think we need to discuss these development proposals very carefully." The ripple of agreement that went through the crowd carried echoes of something older, the same unity of purpose that had first bound the valley's guardians together centuries ago. Frank felt Shadow Walker's approval radiating through their connection. The human part of the ancient alliance was beginning to remember its role. As if in response, a wolf's howl echoed through the village, followed by another and another, a chorus of voices calling out in the gathering dark. No one showed any fear. Instead, Frank saw recognition dawning in his neighbor's eyes. The valley was choosing its guardians once again, and not just among the animals. Dawn broke over the valley 3 days after the storm, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed more vivid through Frank's enhanced vision. He stood on his porch, sipping coffee and watching Shadow Walker and Star Swimmer patrol the farm's perimeter with a precision that still amazed him. Blue trotted between them, no longer just a farm dog, but a liaison between the domestic and wild worlds. The changes in his property were subtle but profound. Where the developer's instruments had detected mineral deposits, Frank now saw glowing lines of energy pulsing beneath the soil. The pond where he'd rescued Star Swimmer had become a focal point of power, its waters occasionally shimmering with those ancient symbols, even in broad daylight. A mental alert from Shadow Walker drew his attention to the eastern forest edge. Through their shared consciousness, he sensed what had caught her attention, strangers approaching, but not the two-legged kind. A mountain lion emerged from the trees, followed by her 3 cubs. In the old reality, this would have been cause for alarm. Now Frank understood they were responding to the same call as the other guardian species. "They're coming to pledge themselves," Joseph said, appearing beside Frank with that uncanny silence he'd grown used to. The great cats were among the original guardians. They remember their obligations. The mountain lion family approached Frank's position with deliberate steps. Through his connection to Shadow Walker, he could sense their intentions, not just paying respects, but offering their services. The mother cat's consciousness touched his mind, sharing images of her family patrolling the valley's higher reaches, watching for intruders that might slip past the lower boundaries. More animals emerged from different directions. A wolf pack moving with military precision, a pair of ancient ravens distinct from the ones already involved, even a massive bull elk whose consciousness carried memories spanning generations. Each approached Frank in turn, touching their minds to his, renewing pledges that dated back to the valley's first human settlements. The last time this many guardian species gathered, Joseph observed, was when my great-grandfather's people first made peace with the European settlers. They recognized something in your ancestors, the same thing the land sees in you now. Through his expanding awareness, Frank could feel the valley's defenses strengthening. Each animal that pledged itself added another layer of protection, another set of eyes watching for threats. The ravens maintained their aerial surveillance, their unified consciousness now linked with the wolf pack's strategic thinking and the bear's raw power. The mountain lion cubs, about the same age as Star Swimmer, began playing with the bear cub. While their mothers communicated on a deeper level, Frank received flashes of their exchange, hunting territories being redrawn, ancient boundaries being respected, but modified to create overlapping zones of protection. A commotion from his chicken coop drew everyone's attention. His hens, normally terrified of predators, were arranging themselves in the same geometric patterns Betty had described at the diner. Through his enhanced senses, Frank realized they were responding to the energy lines beneath their feet, their bodies naturally aligning with the valley's power. Even the domestic animals remember their old roles, Joseph explained. Before we built walls between wild and tame, all creatures shared in the valley's protection. Suddenly all the animals froze. Frank felt it through their shared awareness, a disturbance in the valley's energy field. Shadow Walker's consciousness pressed against his, sharing a vision of men setting up equipment on the valley's eastern ridge. Not Chen's developers this time, but different outsiders with more sophisticated tools. The mountain lions melted back into the forest, heading toward the disturbance. The wolf pack split into smaller groups, moving to prearranged positions with a coordination that spoke of ancient practice. Even the elk had its role, moving casually into view of the intruders, providing a natural explanation for any wildlife activity they might detect. They work together better than most humans, Frank mused, watching the seamless cooperation between species that were supposed to be enemies. They never forgot how, Joseph replied. While we built cities and drew borders, they kept the old ways alive. Now they're teaching us again. Star Swimmer bumped playfully against Frank's legs, then rushed off to continue his training with the other young guardians. Through their bond, Frank felt the cub's joy in learning his role, mixed with an understanding of duty that went soul-deep. The valley was defending itself in ways the developers would never suspect, using an alliance older than human memory. But as Frank watched his new allies move into position, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger confrontation. That night, Frank dreamed in ways he never had before. Through his enhanced connection to the land, his sleeping mind touched something vast and ancient, the collective memory of the valley itself. He saw the first humans arriving in this sacred place, witnessed the original pact being formed between his ancestors and the guardian species. More importantly, he understood why. The valley wasn't just a place of power, it was a seal, a cap on something that slept deep within the mountains. The ancient symbols, the energy lines, the cooperation between species, all of it served to maintain a delicate balance that kept that sleeping force dormant. He awoke to find Shadow Walker waiting by his bed, her consciousness already merged with his. Through their connection, she confirmed what he'd seen. Her bloodline, like his, had been chosen specifically to guard this place. The developers weren't just threatening the land. They risked breaking a seal that had contained an ancient force. Over millennia. You've seen it, haven't you? Joseph asked when Frank arrived at his cabin later that morning. The elder was sorting through old photographs and documents spread across his table. The truth about what we're really protecting. The thing under the mountain, Frank nodded. What exactly is it? Our people have many names for it, Joseph replied, selecting a weathered photograph. But its nature matters less than what it represents. Chaos, imbalance, the undoing of natural law. The valley's power doesn't just protect us from it. It protects the whole world. The photograph showed a cave painting Frank had never seen, intricate symbols similar to those in his pond, but arranged in a pattern that made his enhanced senses tingle. Through his connection to Shadow Walker, who waited outside, he felt a surge of recognition. These were the original seals. The developers' equipment, Frank realized. Their geological surveys. They're detecting the seal's energy, aren't they? And misinterpreting it as mineral deposits, Joseph confirmed. But they're digging their instruments. They're already weakening the barriers. That's why the guardian species are gathering. They sense the danger. Star Swimmer's consciousness brushed against Frank's mind, sharing urgent images. The cub had been practicing with the mountain lion cubs when they discovered something disturbing. New equipment being installed on the valley's western ridge, different from the developers' tools. Through the cubs' keen eyes, Frank saw men working with strange machines that seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. They're here, Joseph said grimly, reading Frank's expression. The ones who know what they're really looking for. The developers are just a front. These are the real threat. The Raven's unified consciousness joined the mental link, sharing aerial views of more teams approaching from different directions. They carried devices that seemed to interact with the valley's energy fields, probing the ancient barriers with deliberate purpose. Through his expanding awareness, Frank felt the land's growing unease. The energy lines that Shadow Walker had reactivated were pulsing more strongly, responding to the intrusion. In the deeper layers of reality that he could now perceive, he saw the sleeping force stir slightly beneath its ages-old bonds. "How do we stop them?" Frank asked. But even as the words left his mouth, he felt the answer forming in the combined consciousness of all the valley's guardians. The animals already knew what needed to be done. They were waiting for the humans to remember their part. "The gathering isn't just a meeting," Joseph explained, gathering up the old documents. "It's a renewal of the original ritual that created the seal. But it requires all the guardian species working in perfect harmony, including humans who understand the old ways." A wolf's howl echoed through the valley, picked up and repeated by others, until the air thrummed with their chorus. Through their shared awareness, Frank felt the message being passed, positions being taken, ancient formations being recreated. The guardian species were moving into a pattern as old as the mountains themselves. "When?" Frank asked, feeling the weight of generations in the question. "The next full moon," Joseph replied, "when the barriers between worlds are thinnest. Either we strengthen the seal then, or we risk losing everything." Star Swimmer's consciousness pressed against his, again sharing not fear but determination. The young bear had already accepted his role in what was to come. Shadow Walker added her own certainty to the link. They would face this threat as their ancestors had, united across the boundaries of species. Frank looked out over his land, seeing now how his farm had been deliberately positioned along the seal's key points. His family hadn't chosen this place by accident. They'd been drawn here by an obligation older than memory. The warning came at midnight, 3 days before the full moon. Frank was awakened by a surge of alarm pulsing through the valley's energy network. Through his link with Shadow Walker, he saw what had triggered it. Trucks moving silently through, the forest with their lights off, men equipped with night vision gear and tranquilizer guns. But these weren't ordinary poachers. Through his enhanced senses, Frank could see dark energy clinging to their equipment, similar to the unsettling pulse from the machines on the ridges. These men knew exactly what they were hunting, and it wasn't just animals. They're targeting the guardian species. Joseph's voice came through the mental link they now shared. They know about the ritual. They're trying to prevent the gathering by removing key participants. The Raven's unified consciousness showed Frank the full scope of the threat. 3 teams of hunters, moving with military precision, each headed toward known territories of different guardian species. Their equipment was tuned to detect the unique energy signatures of the ancient bloodlines. Star Swimmer pressed against Frank's legs, sharing his mother's urgent message. Shadow Walker had already begun coordinating the valley's defenses, calling on every guardian species to protect their young. The mountain lion cubs were being moved to sacred caves marked with protective symbols. Wolf pups were being gathered in underground dens that pulsed with ancient power. They work for whatever's trapped under the mountain, Frank realized, feeling the truth of it in his bones, or at least for people who want to wake it. Through their shared consciousness, he felt Shadow Walker's confirmation. These men carried tokens marked with symbols that were dark reflections of the ones in his pond, signs of allegiance to the chaos that the seal held at bay. Blue growled softly beside him, the dog's enhanced senses detecting movement at the farm's perimeter. Frank reached out with his awareness and felt them, 2 men trying to bypass the energy lines that Shadow Walker had reactivated. Their equipment sparked and sputtered as it encountered the ancient protections. The Ravens moved into action, their perfectly coordinated flight creating patterns in the air that strengthened the valley's defensive barriers. The wolf pack split into hunting parties, moving to intercept the intruders without revealing their true intelligence. Even the elk positioned themselves strategically, their seemingly random movements actually herding the poachers away from critical areas. They're more organized than we expected, one of the hunters said into a radio, his words carried to Frank by a raven's keen hearing. These animals are working together somehow. It's like they know what we're after. Keep pushing, came the reply, distorted by static, but carrying an undertone that made Frank's enhanced senses recoil. We only need to capture one of each guardian line. The ritual can't be completed without full participation. Through his connection to the land, Frank felt the sleeping force stir again, responding to its servant's presence. The energy lines across the valley pulsed more urgently, and the symbols in his pond began glowing with increased intensity. Shadow Walker's consciousness pressed against his, sharing centuries of accumulated knowledge. The poacher's dark equipment couldn't distinguish between guardian bloodlines. They might go after Star Swimmer, thinking any bear cub would do, not realizing that only certain bloodlines could participate in the ritual. The valley's guardian species had maintained careful breeding lines for generations, preserving the specific combinations of energy needed for the seal, a fact that had been encoded in their instincts so deeply that even they hadn't fully understood it until now. The town needs to be warned, Frank said, reaching for his phone. If these men get desperate. Enough. Already done, Joseph replied through their link. Laura has the sheriff's department on alert. The valley remembers how to protect its own. Star Swimmer suddenly stiffened, sharing a vision through their connection. The poachers had something else with them. Cages marked with symbols that could trap not just bodies, but spirits. If they captured any of the true guardian bloodlines, they wouldn't just be removing them from the ritual. They would be corrupting the very essence that made the seal possible. The mountain lions reported another disturbing discovery through their shared awareness. The poachers were setting up equipment at key points around the valley, creating a dark mirror of the protective barriers. They weren't just hunting, they were preparing for something bigger. 3 days until the full moon, Joseph reminded him. We need to protect the guardian bloodlines until then, or the seal will fail, regardless of what else we do. Frank felt the truth of it in the land itself. The valley's ancient defenses were strong, but they were never meant to face an enemy that understood what they were attacking. This wasn't just about protecting animals anymore, it was about preserving the very forces that kept an ancient evil contained. Through their shared consciousness, every guardian species affirmed their commitment. They would not fail. They could not fail. The consequences would reach far beyond their valley. Star Swimmer's urgent consciousness jolted Frank awake before dawn. The bear cub had discovered something while hiding from the poachers. A cave entrance that hadn't been there the day before, revealed by the previous night's rainwashing. Away decades of soil and vegetation. Through their shared vision, Frank saw what made this discovery so significant. The cave's entrance was marked with symbols that matched both the ones in his pond and the dark reflections on the poacher's equipment. But these were older, much older, and they seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The land is helping us, Joseph said, meeting Frank at the cave's entrance 20 minutes later. Shadow Walker and Blue stood guard, while Star Swimmer led them deeper into the mountain. It's revealing what we need to know. The tunnel descended steeply, but Frank's enhanced vision had no trouble penetrating the darkness. The walls were covered in layer upon layer of paintings, each telling part of a story that made his heart race as he began to understand its implications. These aren't just records, he breathed, touching a scene that showed humans and animals, standing in formations around a central point of darkness. Their instructions. The raven's unified consciousness joined their awareness, adding crucial context. The bird's ancestors had witnessed these images being painted, had understood their purpose. Through their shared memory, Frank saw the truth. And the ritual they'd been preparing for wasn't just about reinforcing the seal, it was about completing it. Our ancestors didn't fully succeed, Joseph realized, studying a sequence that showed the sleeping force being contained but not eliminated. They managed to trap it, to bind it, but they couldn't destroy it. Each generation of Guardians has only been maintaining those bonds. Star Swimmer pressed his paw against one of the paintings, and the symbol began to glow with the same green energy they'd seen during the storm. The light spread, illuminating connected symbols until the entire cave system pulsed with power. The paintings weren't just paintings, they were part of the seal itself. A deeper image caught Frank's eye, partially hidden behind centuries of mineral deposits. He carefully brushed away the crystallized layers, revealing a scene that made everything suddenly clear. It showed the original ritual being performed not just by humans and animals working together, but by their combined spiritual essence. "The poachers," Frank said, the revelation hitting him like a physical blow. "That's why they want to capture the Guardian bloodlines alive. The ritual doesn't just need their presence. It needs their willing participation. Their spirits have to choose to help maintain the seal." Shadow Walker's consciousness confirmed his understanding. The ancient evil could only be fully bound or fully released through the willing choice of all Guardian species. Force or coercion wouldn't work. That's why the poachers' cages were designed to trap spirits as well as bodies. But the cave held one more secret. Revealed as Star Swimmer's presence triggered another sequence of glowing symbols. A hidden chamber opened, revealing walls covered in text, written in a script that seemed to shift between human language and animal patterns. "The original pact," Joseph whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Not just what it did, but how it was made. The price that was paid." Frank's enhanced senses translated the ancient writing, and he understood at last what Sarah had meant about the land choosing them. The original Guardians, human and animal alike, had literally bound their bloodlines to this place, tying their spirits to the seal for as long as it needed to be maintained. That's why certain families stayed in the valley generation after generation, why certain animal bloodlines never left. They couldn't leave, not without weakening the very thing they were meant to protect. Through their shared consciousness, every Guardian species acknowledged this truth. They weren't just defenders of the seal, they were part of it. And now, with the full moon approaching and dark forces gathering, they would have to choose whether to renew that ancient commitment. As Frank and Joseph studied the ancient text, they felt a disturbance ripple through the valley's energy field. Through their shared consciousness, they received urgent warnings from the ravens. The poachers had activated their dark equipment. At all 7 points surrounding the valley, the machines pulsed with increasing power, sending waves of disruption through the seal's protective barriers. "They're not just trying to capture the Guardians," Frank realized, watching the ancient symbols on the cave walls flicker in response to each pulse. "They're trying to wake it up early, before we can complete the ritual." Shadow Walker's consciousness merged with his, sharing a vision that made his blood run cold. The thing beneath the mountain was stirring more actively now, its chaotic energy seeping through weakening bonds. Through the bear's deeper connection to the earth, Frank could feel it reaching out, touching the minds of all living things in the valley. But the cave's final chamber held one last revelation. As Star Swimmer approached a particular sequence of symbols, his inherited Guardian energy triggered a transformation. The flat cave wall seemed to dissolve, revealing a three-dimensional projection of the valley itself, crafted from pure light and energy. "This is what the valley really looks like," Joseph breathed, watching the glowing lines of power that crisscross the landscape. "The true seal isn't just in one place. It's everywhere. The farms, the forests, even the town itself. They're all part of the pattern." Frank saw his own farm glowing brightly in the projection, understanding now why his family had built in that exact spot. Every guardian species territory, every ancient trail, every seemingly random feature of the landscape was precisely placed to maintain the seal's geometry. But the projection showed something else too, a darkness spreading beneath the surface, pushing against the bonds that held it. As they watched, the poachers' machines appeared as points of corruption, creating gaps in the valley's defenses. "That's why they needed the development company," Frank said, the truth finally clicking into place. The surveys, the equipment, installation, they were mapping the seal's structure, learning where to place their machines for maximum effect. Through their shared awareness, they felt Shadow Walker's urgent realization. The bear's ancestral memory recognized what the darkness was trying to do. It didn't need to break free completely. It just needed enough of a gap to transfer its essence into a living vessel. That's why the poachers' cages were designed to trap spirits. They don't want to release it, Joseph said grimly. They want to control it, channel it, use its power for themselves. Star Swimmer pressed his paw against another symbol, and the projection changed, showing them the future if they failed. The darkness would spread, using the captured guardian spirits to create more gaps, more weaknesses, until the entire seal failed. The chaos that their ancestors had contained would be loose again, but this time under the control of those who understood just enough to be catastrophically dangerous. The cave's final message became clear. The original ritual wasn't just about binding the darkness. It was about giving the land itself a consciousness, a way to fight back through its chosen guardians. Every generation of humans and animals that renewed the pact had added their own strength to that consciousness. "That's what Sarah meant," Frank whispered. "The land doesn't just need protecting, it protects us. It chose us because we're part of it, and it's part of us." The projection flickered as another wave of dark energy pulsed through the valley. They had less than 48 hours until the full moon, when the seal would be at its weakest and most vulnerable. Either they would complete the ritual and strengthen it forever, or the poachers would succeed in corrupting it completely. Through their shared consciousness, every guardian species acknowledged the choice before them. To renew the pact meant permanently binding their bloodlines to this place, accepting that their descendants would never truly be free to leave. But the alternative was unthinkable. The poachers struck at dusk, 24 hours before the full moon. Their attack was coordinated and sophisticated, beginning with a pulse of dark energy from their machines that temporarily disrupted the valley's protective network. Through his connection to the land, Frank felt the impact like a physical blow, and he wasn't alone. Every guardian species reacted to the assault. The ravens' unified consciousness fragmented momentarily, their carefully maintained formations scattering. The wolf pack's mental links became staticky, making coordination difficult. Even Shadow Walker and Star Swimmer stumbled, their powerful connection to the earth wavering under the dark energy's influence. "They're trying to blind us," Joseph's voice came through their weakened mental link. "Cut off our ability to communicate and coordinate." Frank watched through increasingly unreliable enhanced senses as trucks full of armed men poured into the valley from multiple directions. These weren't just poachers anymore. They were a private army, equipped with both advanced tactical gear and darker implements marked with corrupted versions of the ancient symbols. The ravens fought to reconnect their network, providing fragmented aerial views of the invasion. Teams of hunters were moving with precision toward known guardian territories. Their cages, designed to trap both body and spirit, were mounted on special vehicles that could navigate the rough terrain. Through their disrupted connection, Shadow Walker shared urgent insights from her ancestral memory. The dark pulse hadn't just weakened their defenses, it had strengthened whatever lay beneath the mountain. The ancient evil was pushing harder against its bonds, using the poachers' energy to search for weak points in the seal. "Frank!" Laura's police cruiser skidded to a stop in his driveway. "We've got reports of armed intruders all across the valley. Military-grade weapons, unmarked vehicles. They're—" She stopped, staring at Shadow Walker and Star Swimmer, who hadn't bothered to hide. The bears stood calmly beside Frank, their presence feeling somehow natural despite the situation. "They're here for them," Frank explained, knowing it was time to bring Laura fully into the truth. "For all the guardian species. We need your help to protect them until moonrise tomorrow night." To her credit, Laura absorbed the impossible situation quickly. Through his enhanced senses, Frank could see the valley's energy responding to her bloodline. Another ancient family, another inherited obligation stirring to wakefulness. "The entire department is at your disposal," she said firmly. "But Frank, these men, they're not just well-equipped. They're doing something to our radio communications, our electronics. It's like they're using power that shouldn't exist," Joseph finished, emerging from the shadows. "Because they are. They serve something old and dark, trapped beneath these mountains. If they succeed tonight, they'll gain control of forces they don't truly understand." Another pulse of dark energy rolled through the valley. This time, Frank was ready for it. He drew on his connection to the land itself, anchoring their communication network against the disruption. The Ravens stabilized their formation, their unified consciousness strengthening. The wolf pack's mental links cleared. Shadow Walker suddenly stiffened, sharing a vision through their steadied connection. The poachers weren't just hunting randomly. They were systematically cutting off access to key points where the ritual would need to be performed. If they controlled those locations by moonrise tomorrow, the seal couldn't be reinforced. They know exactly what they're doing, Frank realized. They found the same cave system from another entrance. They have the same information we do. Star. Swimmer pressed against his legs, projecting determination despite his youth. Through their link, the cub shared what the younger guardian animals had been practicing in secret, moving through the valley's hidden paths that existed in multiple layers of reality. They could still reach the ritual sites, but only if the adult guardians could keep the hunters distracted. Laura's radio crackled with reports of more intruders approaching the valley's outer boundaries. The poachers were committing their full force, determined to overwhelm the Guardians through sheer numbers and technological superiority. They didn't realize that technology meant nothing to powers as old as the Earth itself. "We hold until moonrise," Frank said, his voice carrying through the strengthened mental network to every guardian species. "Whatever it takes, whatever we have to do, we hold. The valley chose us for a reason, time to prove it was right." The valley's response to the invasion began with a howl, not from the wolves, but from old Tom Peterson. The elderly resident stood on his porch and released a call that echoed with generations of inherited power. Other voices joined his, human and animal alike, creating harmonics that made the poachers' dark equipment spark and sputter. Through the strengthened mental network, Frank coordinated the valley's defenders. The guardian species moved with practiced precision, implementing strategies they'd been perfecting since the first stirrings of danger. But now they had human allies who remembered their own roles in the ancient pact. Betty Williams' chickens formed intricate patterns in their coop, their synchronized movements generating pulses of energy that strengthened the local barrier. Mike Thompson's horses galloped in geometric formations, their hoofbeats resonating with the Earth's deeper power. Even the town's pets, dogs, cats, and birds, added their energy to the valley's defense. "The domestic guardians," Joseph explained, watching the coordinated effort. "They've been maintaining the seal in their own way all along, working through instinct when their humans forgot the old knowledge." Shadow Walker's consciousness merged with Frank's, showing him the bigger picture. The poachers had expected to face wild animals and unprepared humans. Instead, they found themselves confronting a unified force that moved like a single organism across multiple layers of reality. Laura's police department coordinated with the guardian species instinctively, as if they'd trained for this their whole lives. Deputies positioned their vehicles at key points, reinforcing the energy barriers without fully understanding how they were doing it. Their radios, protected now by the valley's power, carried commands that sounded like routine police work, but actually maintained ancient defensive patterns. Star Swimmer led the younger guardians, bear cubs, wolf pups, mountain lion kittens, and juvenile ravens, through hidden paths that existed between the physical and spiritual realms. They moved ritual components into position, preparing for the ceremony that would need to be performed at moonrise. The ravens' unified consciousness provided constant updates on the poachers' movements. The hunters were facing unexpected resistance everywhere they turned. Their dark equipment, designed to disrupt natural energy patterns, couldn't cope with the complexity of the valley's unified response. They thought technology could overcome tradition, Joseph observed, as another team of poachers found themselves herded away from a ritual site by a seemingly random combination of police roadblocks, wandering livestock, and suddenly flooded roads. They never understood that the land itself is alive and aware. Through their shared awareness, Frank felt the valley's consciousness expanding, drawing on the combined energy of all its guardians. The sleeping force beneath the mountain pushed harder against its bonds, but each attempt was met with strengthened resistance. Martha Jenkins arrived at Frank's farm with her arms full of ancient documents, property deeds, family histories, and surveyor's maps that had been passed down through generations. When laid out on his kitchen table, they formed another version of the pattern they'd seen in the cave, proving that even the valley's human development had followed the seal's sacred geometry. The town council's meeting in emergency session, Laura reported, returning from a quick patrol. They're voting to deny all development permits indefinitely. Not that it matters for tomorrow, but it matters, Frank interrupted. Every decision, every action that honors the valley's true nature strengthens our position. The land remembers. Shadow Walker suddenly broadcasted an alert through their mental network. The poachers were changing tactics, concentrating their forces for a massive push toward the central ritual site, Frank's Pond. They'd realized they couldn't take all the sacred points before moonrise, so they were gambling everything on controlling the most crucial location. Star Swimmer shared urgent images of the hunting teams converging, their dark equipment being combined into larger, more powerful configurations. The Cubs' hidden pathways were becoming unstable as the enemy's corrupted energy increased. They're getting desperate, Joseph warned, which makes them more dangerous. If they can't control the ritual, they'll try to prevent it entirely. Better for their masters to leave the force bound weakly than let us seal it away forever. Through the Raven's eyes, Frank watched the poachers' vehicles moving into attack formation. They had less than 12 hours until moonrise, and the enemy was done with subtle approaches. The night would be long and dangerous. But as Frank looked at the gathered defenders, human and animal, wild and domestic, physical and spiritual, he felt the truth of what Sarah had told him. The land chose its guardians well. They would not fail their ancient trust. Hold fast. He projected through the mental network to all the valley's guardians. Whatever comes, we hold fast. The moon will rise on a free valley, or it won't rise on us at all. The poachers struck an hour before moonrise, their attack heralded by a massive surge of dark energy that set off car alarms throughout Cedar Creek. Their combined equipment towers pulsed with corrupted power, sending waves of disruption through the valley's ancient defenses. The very air seemed to warp around their vehicles as they advanced on Frank's farm. Through the Guardian network, Frank coordinated their response. Shadow Walker led her bear clan in a series of precise movements that looked random, but actually reinforced the energy lines around the pond. The wolf pack split into smaller units, each taking position at key points in the ritual pattern. The mountain lions patrolled the higher ground, preventing the hunters from accessing overlooking positions. The ravens maintained their formation despite the spiritual turbulence, their unified consciousness providing real-time updates on enemy movements. Star Swimmer and the other young guardians stayed hidden in their between-realm paths, protecting the ritual components they'd gathered and waiting for their crucial moment. "They're not just trying to stop us," Joseph warned, reading the dark. "Symbols that flared on the poachers' equipment. They're trying to corrupt the ritual itself. If they can taint even one guardian's participation, the whole seal could be perverted." Laura's police force had established a perimeter that looked like a standard roadblock, but actually completed part of the ancient pattern. Local residents who'd remembered their heritage maintained other sections. Even the domestic animals contributed, their precise positioning strengthening the valley's defenses in ways the poachers couldn't detect. The first wave hit the outer barriers hard. Dark energy clashed with ancient power, creating auroral displays that lit the night sky with competing colors. The poachers had night vision gear, thermal imaging, and other advanced technology. But the Guardians had something far older, a connection to the land itself. Shadow Walker's consciousness merged with Frank's as they faced the main assault together. Through their shared awareness, he could see the multiple layers of reality, where the battle was really being fought. The physical clash of hunters and animals was just a shadow of the spiritual conflict taking place. The corrupted equipment towers began emitting a low frequency that made every guardian species flinch. It resonated with the sleeping force beneath the mountain, encouraging it to push harder against its weakening bonds. The earth itself trembled as ancient evil tested its cage. "The pond," Frank commanded through the mental network. "Everything depends on holding the pond until moonrise." The hunters pressed forward with military precision, using their dark devices to create gaps in the defensive lines. But wherever they breached one layer, they found another waiting. The valley's guardians had been preparing for this moment for generations, even when they didn't know it. Star Swimmer's young voice touched Frank's mind, urgent and determined. The cubs had discovered something in their between-realm paths. The original ritual tools, preserved in a space that wasn't quite physical. They could reach them, but only in the moment when the moon first touched the water. Laura's radio crackled with reports of the poachers' support teams being systematically cut off. The domestic guardians had done their work well. Roads were mysteriously blocked, equipment malfunctioned, and carefully laid plans fell apart. The valley itself seemed to be actively fighting back. The hunters reached the inner perimeter as the moon's edge appeared above the mountains. Their equipment towers combined powers, creating a field of dark energy that threatened to overwhelm the ancient barriers. Shadow Walker roared a challenge that carried through both physical and spiritual realms. What followed was unlike any battle Frank had ever imagined. Guardian species moved in perfect coordination, their actions choreographed. By generations of inherited memory, each animal played its part in a dance that was both combat and ceremony. The raven's song provided rhythm, the wolf's howls added harmony, and the bear's deep vocalizations completed a chord that made the dark equipment shudder. The poachers found their cages wouldn't close, their weapons wouldn't fire, and their devices sparked dangerously. The domestic guardians added their voices to the growing symphony, cattle lowing, horses neighing, even chickens adding their calls in perfect time. The combined sound resonated with frequencies that had been old when the mountains were young. As moonlight touched the pond's surface, Star Swimmer and his young companions emerged from their hidden paths, carrying artifacts that glowed with pure ancient power. The ritual tools recognized their true guardians, responding with light that cut through the darkness like silver blades. "Now!" Frank commanded, and every guardian species moved as one. The ravens spiraled downward, creating a vortex of air that swept away the poachers' darkness. The wolves and mountain lions formed precise patterns around the pond, their bodies completing circuits of power that had been waiting for this moment. Shadow Walker and her bears took position at key points, their massive forms anchoring the energy flows. The hunters tried one final desperate attack. They triggered their equipment's full power, creating a wave of corruption that would have shattered normal defenses. But the Guardians weren't defending anymore. They were attacking. Generations of accumulated power, centuries of maintained connections, and the combined will of every Guardian species focused into a single purpose. The ritual began with a pulse of pure light from the pond's depths. The symbols carved there millennia ago blazed to life, answering the call of the original. Tools. Each Guardian species contributed its unique energy to the pattern, ravens bringing sky power, wolves adding earth strength, bears contributing spirit force, and humans providing the bridge between realms. Frank felt Sarah's presence as a power built, her spirit joining countless others who had maintained this trust through the ages. The poacher's dark equipment overloaded and failed as something far older and stronger took control. The sleeping force beneath the mountain raged against its bonds, but those bonds were being renewed by powers it couldn't overcome. Star Swimmer led the young Guardians in their crucial role, their innocent spirits untainted by darkness, providing the final key needed to complete the seal. The ritual tools responded to their pure intention, releasing the full power that had been waiting for this moment. Light erupted from every Guardian species, every ritual tool, every sacred point in the valley. The pattern that had been maintained for generations finally completed itself. Frank felt the change ripple through reality, as the seal wasn't just reinforced, it was perfected. The ancient evil wasn't just bound anymore, it was transformed, its dark power converted into strength for the very barriers that contained it. The poachers fled as their equipment exploded, taking their corrupted symbols with them. But the Guardians weren't finished. The valleys combined. Power reached out, erasing the memory of its true nature from the minds of its enemies. The hunters would remember only a failed operation. Their masters would find their corrupted knowledge fading like a dream. As the ritual completed, Frank felt the valley settling into a new pattern. The seal was stronger than ever, but more importantly, it was alive in a way it hadn't been before. Every Guardian species was now truly part of it, their connection to the land and each other permanently strengthened. The moon reached its peak as the last traces of darkness faded. Shadow Walker shared a vision of the valley's true appearance, a complex living web of power that connected every Guardian, every sacred point, every layer of reality. What had been hidden was now clear to those who were part of it. What had been dormant was now fully awake. Star Swimmer bounced excitedly as the young Guardians realized what they had helped create. This wasn't just a renewal of the old bonds. It was the beginning of something new. The valley hadn't just been defended. It had been transformed into something stronger, something that would endure. Through their shared consciousness, every Guardian species acknowledged the change. They were no longer just protectors of the seal, they were part of it. The valley's power was their power, its life was their life, and its future was in their hands. A month after the battle, Frank stood on his porch, watching Star Swimmer playing with the mountain lion cubs in his front yard. The sight would have been impossible before, but it was just part of daily life now in Cedar Creek. The valley's transformation had changed everything, yet somehow made it all seem natural. The development companies had withdrawn their permits, their surveyors unable to remember why they'd been so interested in the area. The poachers' dark masters found their corrupted knowledge fading like smoke, leaving them with only a deep instinctive aversion to the valley. The seal wasn't just stronger, It was now self-maintaining, actively protecting itself through its connection to all its guardians. Through their permanent mental link, Shadow Walker shared her contentment. The bear matriarch had made Frank's farm her clan's primary territory, though the concept of territory had changed. The guardian species moved freely through the valley now, their ancient rivalries transformed into cooperative stewardship. The townspeople had adapted remarkably well. Laura's police department coordinated naturally with the wolf pack's patrols. Martha's general store stocked special feed for both domestic and wild guardians. Even old Tom had started offering valley history tours that somehow never revealed too much while still honoring the truth. "The land remembers," Joseph said, materializing beside Frank as he often did now. But more importantly, it lives. What we created that night wasn't just a new seal, it was a new way of being. Frank nodded, feeling the valley's living energy blowing through every guardian species. The ravens maintained their aerial watch more out of joy than duty now. The wolves and mountain lions coordinated their hunting to maintain natural balance. Even the domestic animals participated fully in the valley's new consciousness. Sarah would have loved this, Frank thought, and felt the valley respond with a pulse of warm energy. His wife had known, had tried to prepare him. Now, her journals were part of the valley's official record, helping future generations understand their heritage. Star Swimmer had grown, not just physically, but spiritually. The young bear was already showing signs of becoming a powerful guardian in his own right. Through him and the other young ones, the valley's new pattern would continue to evolve and strengthen. "We did more than save this place," Frank said. "Watching the next generation of guardians at play, we helped it become what it was always meant to be." The valley thrummed with agreement, its consciousness touching every guardian species with acceptance and belonging. The land hadn't just chosen them, it had made them truly part of itself. And in doing so, it had transformed a simple farmer's act of compassion into something eternal. The ancient evil slept peacefully now beneath the mountain, its power converted into strength for the very barriers that contained it. The valley had become its own best guardian, alive and aware and protected by all who called it home. And somewhere, in the space between worlds, Sarah smiled.